Well, let's talk about another aspect of a different kind of pain before the fall, and that is physical pain. We have some hints about that in the text for the woman. For example, in the curse, it says her pain in childbirth will be multiplied in chapter 3. It doesn't indicate, the pain is going to be introduced for the first time. It hints at that it's going to be multiplied, which seems like it was already there in the first place.
Well, let me bring up the radical idea, too, that pain is good for us. We have physical conditions we know of where individuals cease to experience pain. Leprosy is a good example of that. And obviously the condition for that individual is far worse than for those of us that are able to experience pain. And in one sense, physical pain is just a certain degree removed from physical pleasure. If you take away the possibility for us experiencing physical pain, you also remove the possibility for us to experience physical pleasure.
But I want to focus here on the textual evidence that there was pain before the fall. This word, I think it's rabah, which the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament defines as to become great, many, much, numerous. So the idea here is that the woman's pain in childbirth
has been
greatly increased, not necessarily introduced for the first time. And so there's a hint there that there was, in fact, physical pain as well before the fall.
Right, but it's sin that makes that pain greater.
Yeah. Now, Marj, I want you to jump in here. Another thing that I've heard some talk about before the fall is, what about disease before the fall? Have you heard about that?
Yeah, there's often the discussion about the fossil record that in the dinosaur bones, for instance, you see evidence of cancer, you see evidence of arthritis, and there's obviously been a lot of death and suffering. And so therefore, that is their conclusion of many Christians, that those fossils had to be laid down during the flood because you couldn't have had something like that so horrible before the fall.
So there was no disease before the fall.
Of animals or anything.
And, you're a resident biologist here. If you have no disease, what does that imply to the natural world?
Well, many diseases, for example, diseases like cancer, is just simply a consequence of that organism being exposed to the laws of physics or being exposed to the natural realm. It's essentially a situation in which the biochemistry of that organism begins to fail.
Well, I've heard people claim there was no bacteria and no viruses until the fall of Adam in Eden. But in many contexts, viruses and bacteria are good for us. If you take away the bacteria, would we even be able to live here on this planet? I would argue no, we wouldn't be able to survive here.
Well, nitrogen fixation, for example, the process in which plants are able to take nitrogen from the atmosphere and convert it into ammonia and ammonium salts necessary in order for that plant to survive, is all mediated by a bacterium.
Well, even our digestion process involves beneficial bacteria.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Ken, I want to ask you from a theological perspective, do you see any inherent conflict with there being cancer and disease in the fossil record with animals and God's quote-unquote very good creation? I mean, I think that's really where the rub is for some Christians. It's hard for them to imagine that there could be disease in animals and have that be part of what God pronounces very good.
Yeah, I think it takes us back to that question of, is disease and cancer and these terrible things we see, is that in any way consistent with God and what God would create? Again, I would raise the question, and my sister died of cancer 3 years ago. It was a very difficult thing for our entire family. I must say, though, at the moment of her death, there was a relief of that suffering, which again ties the fact that death is not always the worst circumstance. In fact, I can think of a number of things that are worse than dying. And I think your point is quite relevant here. We have to be careful about thinking about God's character in a sentimental way. There are things out there in nature that sometimes I scratch my head about, parasites and things of that nature, but I realize that I don't have all of the answers to God's created order, nor do I know everything that's happening at one time. I would again come back to the fact that God orders the world, that He is sovereign. and that he has purposes for these things, and that pain doesn't always hurt, meaning that some pain is actually quite good for us. It keeps us from other conditions that are even far worse. I think suffering for all eternity apart from Christ is a much worse scenario
Than cancer.
Than cancer. Abusing your body in this life and having your soul punished in the next is much worse than any physical pain.
Well, let's talk a minute about